The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Montgomery County Courthouse as Sarah Bennett walked up the wide stone staircase. Her natural confidence showed in every step, even though she was running a few minutes late for her 9:30 a.m. traffic violation hearing. She wore a simple but elegant dark blue dress that moved gracefully with each step, and her hair was styled in neat, professional braids. Sarah had spent the early morning hours in her home recording studio, finishing a voiceover project for a popular children's show. The session had run longer than expected, forcing her to rush to the courthouse. Still, she remained calm. Having voiced hundreds of characters over her 10-year career, she was used to handling pressure with grace. The courthouse's heavy wooden doors creaked as she pushed them open. The familiar smell of old books and wood polish filled the air. The main hall buzzed with activity. Lawyers in suits hurried past with briefcases, worried defendants sat on wooden benches, and court officers directed traffic with practiced efficiency. Sarah checked the digital board on the wall. Courtroom 3B, Judge Richard Matthews presiding. She quickly found her way through the maze-like hallways, her comfortable flats making little noise on the polished floor. Outside courtroom 3B, a small crowd had gathered. Most people looked nervous, some were whispering to their lawyers, but Sarah simply took a seat and pulled out her phone to review some script lines for tomorrow's recording. All rise. The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom doors at exactly 9:30 a.m. Sarah and the others filed into the courtroom, finding seats in the rows of wooden benches. The room was impressive, with high ceilings and large windows that let in streams of natural light. The American flag stood proud next to the judge's bench, and the seal of Montgomery County was displayed prominently on the wall. Judge Richard Matthews entered the courtroom with measured steps. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat perfectly straight on his nose. His black robe seemed to add extra weight to his already commanding presence. He had been serving on this bench for over 20 years, and his reputation for running a strict courtroom was well known throughout the county. As Sarah watched the proceedings, she noticed how Judge Matthews handled each case. He was quick, efficient, and showed little patience for excuses or long explanations. His tone remained formal and slightly cold, his expressions rarely changing as he handed down his decisions. She observed how some defendants stumbled over their words in front of him, while others seemed to shrink under his stern gaze. The court clerk called out, "Case number 2023 TR 4578, Sarah Bennett, traffic violation, section 545.351. Sarah stood up smoothly and made her way to the podium. She felt completely at ease, used to performing under pressure. Her posture was relaxed but respectful, her expression neutral but engaged. Years of voice acting had taught her how to control her presence in any room. Judge Matthews looked down at her from his elevated bench, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed her composed demeanor. Most defendants showed at least some nervousness in his courtroom, but Sarah stood there as if she was simply waiting in line at a coffee shop. He glanced at the citation in front of him, speeding 15 miles over the limit on Madison Avenue. "Ms. Bennett," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "you are charged with exceeding the posted speed limit by 15 miles per hour in a residential zone. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied in her clear, well-modulated voice, the same voice that had brought joy to millions of children through their favorite cartoon characters, though Judge Matthews didn't know that yet. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly at her direct response and what he perceived as an overly casual tone. He was used to people speaking to him with more deference, more anxiety in their voices. Sarah's professional confidence, honed through years of studio work and public appearances, struck him as borderline disrespectful. Little did he know that the woman standing before him had won 3 Voice Arts Awards, or that her voice was featured in some of the most popular animated shows on television. To him, she was just another defendant who didn't seem to take his courtroom seriously enough. And that perception would soon lead him to make a decision he would later regret deeply. Judge Matthews shuffled the papers on his desk, his fingers lingering over Sarah Bennett's traffic citation. The morning light streaming through the tall courthouse windows caught his silver wedding ring as he adjusted his reading glasses. Something about this defendant's attitude bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "Ms. Bennett," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades on the bench, "can you explain to the court why you were traveling at such an excessive speed in a residential area?" His tone was clipped, more stern than usual. Sarah stood straight at the podium, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Yes, Your Honor. I was heading to a recording session that morning, and I made a poor decision to speed. I take full responsibility for my actions. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying naturally through the courtroom without effort. A skill developed through years of voice acting. The judge's frown deepened. To his ears, trained by years of hearing desperate excuses and nervous apologies, Sarah's professional tone sounded almost rehearsed. He didn't know that this was simply her natural way of speaking, perfected through thousands of hours in recording booths. A recording session? He repeated, his tone skeptical. Ms. Bennett, this court deals with serious matters of public safety. Speeding in a residential area puts children at risk. This isn't some kind of performance. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably at the judge's harsh tone. The court clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had worked with Judge Matthews for 15 years, glanced up from her computer with surprise. She had rarely heard him take such an immediate dislike to a defendant, especially one who was being cooperative. Sarah remained composed, though her hands tightened slightly around each other. I understand completely, Your Honor. As someone who works with children's programming, I especially regret. Miss Bennett, Judge Matthews cut her off. His patience wearing thin. The standard fine for this violation is $150. However, given your apparent lack of serious regard for this matter, and to ensure the message about public safety is clearly received, I am setting the fine at $500. A quiet murmur ran through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, Officer Thompson, raised his eyebrows slightly. He had seen hundreds of similar traffic violations in this court, and few had ever received more than the standard fine, especially for a first offense. Sarah blinked, surprised by the judge's decision. Your Honor, I. Additionally, Judge Matthews continued, his voice rising slightly, you will attend a mandatory traffic safety course. Perhaps that will help you understand the seriousness of your actions. He made a note in the case file, his pen pressing harder into the paper than necessary. The court clerk typed quickly, her fingers hesitating slightly as she entered the unusually harsh fine. She had processed thousands of traffic violations over the years, and something about this sentence felt off. Just that morning, she had seen the judge give a standard $150 fine to a young man who had been going 20 miles over the limit. Sarah took a deep breath, her professional training helping her maintain composure. I understand, Your Honor. When would you like the fine to be paid by? Payment is due within 30 days, Judge Matthews replied curtly. The clerk will provide you with information about the safety course, which must be completed within 60 days. Failure to comply will result in additional penalties. He didn't look up as he spoke, already reaching for the next case file. As Sarah turned to leave the podium, she caught a sympathetic glance from Mrs. Rodriguez, the clerk. The older woman had been watching the whole exchange with growing concern, wondering what had prompted such an unusual response from the usually fair-minded judge. Walking back through the gallery, Sarah held her head high, though her heart was heavy. She had expected a fine, but the judge's hostile attitude and the inflated penalty had caught her off guard. As she passed through the heavy courtroom doors, she pulled out her phone to check her schedule. She had another recording session in 2 hours, this time voicing a wise grandmother character who taught children about fairness and understanding. The irony wasn't lost on her. Inside the courtroom, Judge Matthews called the next case, already pushing thoughts of Sarah Bennett to the back of his mind. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, a chance encounter with his grandchildren's favorite TV show would force him to confront his unconscious biases and reconsider this morning's harsh judgment. Judge Richard Matthews sat in his favorite leather armchair, finally relaxing after a long day in court. The evening sun cast warm shadows across his living room as his 2 grandchildren, Emma, 8, and Tyler, 6, sprawled on the carpet in front of the television. It was their weekly sleepover at Grandpa's house, a tradition he had maintained since their parents, his daughter and son-in-law, had started date night Thursdays. Grandpa, it's starting. Emma called out excitedly, turning up the volume on their favorite show, Adventure Academy. The familiar theme music filled the room, bringing a smile to the judge's tired face. These moments with his grandchildren helped him forget about the weight of his judicial responsibilities. Tyler scooted closer to the TV, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Miss Luna is in this episode, he announced proudly, referring to the wise owl character who taught the show's young heroes about important life lessons. Judge Matthews leaned back, half listening to the show while checking emails on his phone, but suddenly a voice caught his attention. A familiar voice, warm, clear, and perfectly modulated. He looked up at the screen, where the animated owl character was speaking to a group of young students. "Remember, dear ones," Miss Luna said in that hauntingly familiar voice, "true wisdom comes from listening to others with an open heart and mind." The judge's phone slipped from his fingers onto his lap. He knew that voice. He had heard it just that morning in his courtroom. But it couldn't be. "Emma," he called to his granddaughter, trying to keep his voice casual, "who plays Miss Luna?" "That's Sarah Bennett, Grandpa," Emma replied without taking her eyes off the screen. "She's the best. She also does the voice of Princess Melody in Rainbow Kingdom and the mom in Little Heroes." Judge Matthews felt the color drain from his face. The Sarah Bennett he had fined $500 that morning, the woman he had accused of not taking things seriously, was Miss Luna, his grandchildren's beloved teacher of wisdom and fairness. On screen, Miss Luna continued her lesson, each word now hitting the judge like a physical blow. "Sometimes we make quick judgments without knowing the whole story," the owl character said gently. "But that's how we miss the magic in others." Tyler rolled over and looked at his grandfather. "Are you okay, Grandpa? You look funny." "I'm fine," Judge Matthews managed to say, but he wasn't fine. His mind was racing back through the morning's court session. He had interpreted Sarah Bennett's professional composure as disrespect, her clear-speaking voice as arrogance. Now he realized she was using the same voice that had taught his grandchildren countless lessons about kindness, understanding, and fairness. The episode continued, but Judge Matthews barely heard it. He pulled out his phone again, this time searching for Sarah Bennett voice actor. The results made his stomach sink further. Pictures appeared of Sarah at charity events, reading to children at hospitals. Articles praised her work with youth literacy programs and her foundation that taught communication skills to underprivileged kids. One headline read, "Voice acting star Sarah Bennett opens free speech therapy clinic in Montgomery County." "Did you know?" Emma piped up, noticing her grandfather's interest. "Miss Luna, Sarah Bennett, came to my school last month. She taught us how to speak clearly and not be scared of talking in front of people. She was so nice." Judge Matthews felt the weight of his morning's decision pressing down on him like a physical burden. The woman he had punished for what he perceived as a lack of seriousness was, in reality, someone who devoted her life to helping children. Her composed demeanor wasn't disrespect. It was the poise of a professional voice actor who spoke to millions of children every day. As Miss Luna's voice continued to fill the room with wisdom and warmth, Judge Matthews made a decision. First thing tomorrow, he would review Sarah Bennett's case. But more than that, he would need to examine his own biases and assumptions. How many other times had he let his preconceptions cloud his judgment? "Grandpa, watch this part," Tyler called out, pulling the judge from his thoughts. "Miss Luna is going to help the children solve their biggest problem ever." "Yes," Judge Matthews said quietly, more to himself than to his grandson, "I believe she is." After putting his grandchildren to bed, Judge Matthews sat in his home office, the soft glow of his computer screen illuminating his troubled face. It was nearly midnight, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. He had spent the last 3 hours diving deep into Sarah Bennett's career and accomplishments, and with each new discovery, the weight of his earlier judgment grew heavier. His web browser had dozens of tabs open. One showed a local news article from just last month. Voice actor Sarah Bennett opens 5th free speech therapy center. Another displayed her professional website, listing hundreds of voice acting credits. But it was the video playing on his screen that truly captured his attention. The video showed Sarah speaking at a high school graduation. She stood at the podium, wearing the same confident but peaceful expression she had shown in his courtroom. "Many of you know my voice from your favorite shows," she was saying, "but today, I want you to hear my story." Judge Matthews leaned forward, turning up the volume slightly. Sarah went on to describe growing up in a poor neighborhood, struggling with a childhood stutter that made other kids laugh at her. Instead of breaking her, it had inspired her to transform her greatest weakness into her greatest strength. He opened another tab, finding an interview where Sarah explained her nonprofit organization, Voices of Hope. The program helped children with speech impediments and social anxiety learn to find their voices. The article mentioned that she used her voice acting income to fund most of the program herself. Over 5,000 kids helped since 2019. He read aloud to himself, the words sticking in his throat. The same woman he had accused of not taking things seriously had dedicated her life to helping children overcome their fears and find their voices. His email notification pinged. It was from Mrs. Rodriguez, his court clerk, responding to his urgent request for information about similar traffic violations from the past month. Her data showed what he had feared. Out of 37 speeding tickets for the same offense, only Sarah had received more than the standard fine. The evidence of his bias was there in black and white. Judge Matthews pushed back from his desk, walking to the window. The street below was quiet, the neighboring houses dark. In one of them, a television flickered with late-night cartoons. He wondered if it was playing one of the many shows featuring Sarah's voice work. Returning to his computer, he found a video of Sarah at a children's hospital. She was doing different character voices for sick kids, making them laugh despite their pain. One small girl with no hair, clearly going through chemotherapy, was giggling uncontrollably as Sarah switched between a princess voice and a grumpy old dragon. The judge opened his court notebook, starting to write. Case review. Bennett, Sarah, traffic violation. His pen hesitated over the paper. How could he put into words the magnitude of his error? How could he explain that he had let his biases affect his judgment of someone who contributed so much to society? His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. Dad, Emma wants to know if Miss Luna will teach the class about forgiveness in next week's episode. She's still awake thinking about it. The irony hit him hard. Here was his granddaughter, learning about forgiveness from Sarah Bennett's character, while he sat struggling with his own need for forgiveness from Sarah herself. He pulled up the court's electronic filing system. Though it was well past midnight, he began preparing the paperwork for a sua sponte review of the case, a judge's right to reconsider his own ruling. But he knew this wasn't enough. The fine could be reduced, the record could be amended, but the real work needed to go deeper. Judge Matthews opened a new document and began typing. Proposal: mandatory bias training for Montgomery County Courthouse staff. As he typed, he could almost hear Miss Luna's wise voice saying, "Every mistake is a chance to learn and grow." His cursor blinked on the screen as he added a note. Potential guest speaker: Sarah Bennett. It was a long shot, he knew, but perhaps his error could become a teaching moment for the entire courthouse. First, though, he would need to face her again, not as a stern judge looking down from his bench, but as a human being who had made a mistake and needed to make it right. Sleep refused to come to Judge Matthews that night. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling as memories from his 20 years on the bench played through his mind like an endless movie. The digital clock on his bedside table blinked 3:15 a.m., its red numbers seeming to mock his restlessness. Every face he had judged, every decision he had made, now came under the harsh spotlight of self-examination. How many times had he let his first impressions, his unconscious beliefs, color his judgments? The question burned in his mind like a hot coal. Unable to stay in bed any longer, he got up and walked to his home office. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the heating system. On his desk lay the manila folder of case files Mrs. Rodriguez had pulled for him before leaving court. Similar traffic violations from the past 6 months. Judge Matthews turned on his desk lamp and began reading through the cases one by one. James Anderson, white male, 45, speeding in a school zone, standard fine. Robert Chen, Asian male, 32, running a red light, standard fine. But then he noticed a pattern that made his stomach turn. The harsher sentences, the higher fines, they seemed to fall disproportionately on certain groups. He pushed back from his desk and walked to the window. The street outside was dark and empty, but in his mind, he could see Sarah Bennett standing at his podium. He had interpreted her professional composure as arrogance, her clear speaking voice as disrespect. Why? The answer made him uncomfortable. His phone buzzed on the desk, a text from his daughter. Dad, Emma made this for you at school today. She says it's you and Miss Luna having tea together. The attached photo showed a child's drawing of an owl and a man in a black robe sitting at a table, surrounded by hearts. Judge Matthews felt tears prick at his eyes. His granddaughter, in her innocent wisdom, had imagined a scene of reconciliation between her grandfather and her beloved cartoon teacher. If only real-life healing could be as simple as a child's crayon drawing. He returned to his desk and opened his laptop. The browser was still open to Sarah Bennett's nonprofit website. A video began playing automatically. Sarah was working with a young boy who stuttered, gently encouraging him to speak into a microphone. "Take your time," she said softly. "Your voice matters. Every word is worth waiting for." The judge reached for his legal pad and began writing. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Questions for self-examination." Below it, he listed, "How often do I make snap judgments based on appearance or manner? What assumptions do I bring into my courtroom each day? How can I ensure every person who stands before me receives truly equal treatment? What systems can we put in place to check for bias in our decisions?" His pen moved faster as more questions came to mind. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, he had filled several pages. But questions weren't enough. He needed answers, actions, change. Judge Matthews stood up and walked to his bathroom to prepare for the day ahead. In the mirror, he saw the dark circles under his eyes from his sleepless night. But he also saw something else: determination. Today would be different. Today would be the first day of what he hoped would become his most important work on the bench. As he adjusted his tie, he could almost hear Miss Luna's voice from his grandchildren's show. "The hardest person to judge fairly is yourself, but that's where all wisdom begins." He picked up his briefcase, heavier now with the added weight of his night's research and reflections. Before leaving for the courthouse, he sent a text to Mrs. Rodriguez. "Please clear my lunch hour today. I need to make some important calls." The first call would be to the Administrative Office of Courts, requesting permission to review all the sentences from the past year. The second would be to Dr. James Wilson, an expert on judicial bias who had been offering training sessions that Matthews had previously deemed unnecessary. As he drove to work, the rising sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was beginning, and with it, the chance to turn an error in judgment into a catalyst for real change. Judge Matthews arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual that morning. The sun had barely risen, and only the cleaning staff and a few early bird clerks roamed the marble halls. He carried 2 cups of coffee as he made his way to Mrs. Rodriguez's desk, where she was already sorting through the day's files. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, looking up with surprise at the offered coffee. "In 15 years, this was a first. You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," he admitted, sitting down in the chair beside her desk. "Maria, I need your help with something important." He pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. "I want to review every sentence I've handed down in the past year, every single one." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes widened as she took a sip of her coffee. "That's hundreds of cases, Your Honor. Maybe thousands." She paused, then added gently, "This is about yesterday's traffic case, isn't it? The voice actor?" Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was an email from Dr. James Wilson, responding to his late-night message. "Dear Judge Matthews, I'm intrigued by your sudden interest in our judicial bias training program. I can be at your courthouse this afternoon. This is a priority for us." The judge showed Mrs. Rodriguez the email. "I've also called an emergency meeting with all the courthouse staff for 9 a.m. Can you help spread the word?" Over the next 2 hours, the quiet courthouse transformed into a hub of activity. Judges, clerks, bailiffs, and administrative staff gathered in the large conference room. Curious about the unusual morning meeting, Judge Matthews stood at the front, his usual commanding presence softened by humility. "Yesterday," he began, his voice carrying through the silent room, "I made a mistake that forced me to confront something uncomfortable about myself and potentially about our entire system." He proceeded to tell them about Sarah Bennett, about his unfair judgment, and about his sleepless night of self-examination. In the back of the room, Bailiff Thompson nodded slowly. He had witnessed the interaction and had felt something was off. Other staff members exchanged knowing looks. They too had seen similar situations, but few had expected this kind of acknowledgement, especially from the usually strict Judge Matthews. "Starting today," the judge continued, "we're implementing new procedures." He clicked to the first slide of his hastily prepared presentation. "Every sentence will be reviewed for consistency. Every fine will be compared against similar cases. And most importantly, we're all going to undergo comprehensive bias training." A young clerk raised her hand. "Your Honor, is this really necessary? We all try to be fair." Judge Matthews smiled sadly. I thought the same thing for 20 years, but trying isn't enough if we don't acknowledge our blind spots. He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from his night of research. The patterns of disparity were clear and undeniable. As the meeting continued, Mrs. Rodriguez quietly slipped out to make some calls. By noon, she had coordinated with Dr. Wilson's office to set up a 6-week training program. She had also reached out to the State Judicial Review Board, who expressed strong interest in using Montgomery County's initiative as a pilot program for other courthouses. Judge Matthews spent his lunch break recording every detail of his bias training proposal. His sandwich sat untouched as he worked, driven by a new sense of purpose. On his computer screen, he had a tab open to Sarah Bennett's latest interview about her youth education programs. Her words about transformation and growth played in the background as he typed. By late afternoon, the courthouse was buzzing with activity of a different kind. Judges were reviewing their past cases, clerks were compiling statistics, and staff members were signing up for the first round of training sessions. The initiative that had started with one unfair traffic fine was growing into something much bigger. As Judge Matthews finally sat down to eat his forgotten lunch, Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on his chamber door. Your Honor, the Chief Justice's office called. They want to know more about our new bias review program. She paused, then added with a small smile, and I just checked. Miss Bennett's fine hasn't been paid yet. We still have time to make this right. The judge nodded, reaching for his phone. Making it right would take more than just adjusting one fine. It would take systemic change. But for the first time in 24 hours, he felt like he was on the right path. A week had passed since Judge Matthews' revelation about Sarah Bennett. Now he sat in his chambers, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the carefully worded letter in front of him for the 20th time. The morning sun streamed through his window, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. Miss Bennett, the letter began, I am writing to formally apologize for my recent judgment in your traffic violation case. He had rewritten these words countless times, trying to find the right balance between professional responsibility and genuine remorse. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Rodriguez entered, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. Your Honor, Miss Bennett's agent called back. She agreed to meet with you today at 2 p.m. She paused, then added, she's recording at the studio 3 blocks from here. Judge Matthews felt his heart rate increase. It was one thing to write an apology letter. It was another to deliver it in person. He glanced at the family photo on his desk, his grandchildren beaming next to a person in a Miss Luna owl costume at a children's event. Emma had insisted he put it there as a reminder. At 1:55 p.m., the judge walked into the small conference room he had chosen for the meeting. It was less formal than his chambers, with comfortable chairs and large windows overlooking the city park. He had deliberately avoided the courtroom. This wasn't about authority anymore. Sarah Bennett arrived exactly on time, wearing a professional blue dress similar to the one she had worn in court. Her presence was just as composed as before, but now the judge saw it differently, not as arrogance, but as the poise of someone who had transformed her childhood struggles into strength. Miss Bennett, he began, standing to greet her. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Your Honor, she replied, her voice carrying that same clear, warm quality that had captured his grandchildren's hearts through their television screen. Your letter intrigued me. They sat down, and Judge Matthews noticed his hands were trembling slightly as he opened his folder. First, he said, I want to show you something. He pulled out a stack of papers, his analysis of similar traffic violations from the past year. Your fine was significantly higher than any other for the same offense. This wasn't justice, this was bias. Sarah looked at the papers quietly, her expression thoughtful. The judge continued, I didn't know who you were when you stood in my courtroom, but the truth is, I should have treated you with the same respect regardless of who you are or what you do for a living. Your Honor. Sarah spoke softly, may I tell you a story? When he nodded, she continued, when I was young, I struggled with a severe stutter. People made assumptions about me based on how I spoke, or sometimes couldn't speak. That's why I became a voice actor, to prove that voices come in many forms, and they all deserve to be heard. Judge Matthews felt the weight of her words. He reached for another document, the official order reducing her fine to the standard amount. This is the least I can do, he said, sliding it across the table, but I want to do more. He explained about the bias training program, about the courthouse-wide initiative to review sentencing patterns. And, he added hesitantly, if you're willing, we would be honored to have you speak at our first training session. Your perspective would be invaluable. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying the judge's face. Then she smiled, the same warm smile that had helped thousands of children feel confident about their own voices. You know, Judge Matthews, in my work, I often voice characters who learn important lessons. But it's rare to see adults who are willing to learn and change like this. She reached into her bag and pulled out a DVD. This is a new episode of Adventure Academy that hasn't aired yet. Miss Luna teaches the children about the courage it takes to admit mistakes and the power of making things right. Would you like to watch it with your grandchildren? The judge felt tears prick at his eyes. I would like that very much, he said softly. As they stood to leave, Sarah turned to him one last time. Your Honor, thank you for showing that justice isn't just about making decisions. It's about being willing to revisit them when necessary. Judge Matthews watched her leave, then turned to look out the window at the courthouse steps below. Tomorrow, those steps would lead to a courthouse that was starting to change, one decision at a time. 3 months had passed since Judge Matthews' meeting with Sarah Bennett. The Montgomery County Courthouse looked the same from the outside, its stone steps still worn smooth by countless footsteps, but inside, things were different. The changes were subtle but significant, like ripples spreading across a quiet pond. On this bright morning, the largest conference room was filled to capacity. Judges, lawyers, and court staff from 3 neighboring counties had come to hear about Montgomery County's new bias awareness program. At the podium stood Sarah Bennett, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the crowd. Change, she was saying, begins with a single moment of recognition. For me, it was realizing that my childhood stutter wasn't a weakness, but a path to helping others find their voices. For Judge Matthews, it was a traffic fine that led to a complete transformation of this courthouse's approach to justice. In the front row, Judge Matthews sat with perfect posture, but his expression was softer than it had been 3 months ago. On his desk back in his chambers, a new photo stood next to the one of his grandchildren, a group picture from the first bias training session, with Sarah and the entire courthouse staff smiling together. Mrs. Rodriguez, sitting next to him, looked down at her tablet. The new case review system they had implemented was showing promising results. Average fines had become more consistent across all demographic groups. Response times were more uniform. Even the way court staff interacted with visitors had changed, becoming more patient and understanding. Sarah clicked to her next slide, showing a graph of the courthouse's progress. But numbers only tell part of the story, she continued. The real change happens in moments no one sees. It happens when a judge takes an extra minute to listen, when a clerk offers a kind word, when we all remember that every person who walks through these doors deserves to be heard. In the back of the room, a young public defender wiped tears from her eyes. Just last week, she had watched Judge Matthews handle a case involving a nervous teenager who reminded him of Sarah's story about her childhood stutter. The judge had spoken with such patience, making sure the boy felt heard and understood before making his ruling. The presentation screen changed to show a clip from Adventure Academy. Miss Luna, Sarah's beloved owl character, was teaching young animals about fairness and understanding. Several people in the audience smiled, recognizing their children's favorite show. Today, Sarah said, gesturing to Judge Matthews, I'm proud to announce that Montgomery County's bias review program is being adopted by the state judicial system as a model for other courthouses. What started as one moment of recognition has grown into a movement for change. Judge Matthews stood up, joining Sarah at the podium. His voice was steady as he addressed his colleagues. 3 months ago, I made a mistake that opened my eyes, but acknowledging that mistake wasn't enough. Real change required action, commitment, and the courage to look at ourselves honestly. He turned to Sarah with a smile. Ms. Bennett taught me that justice isn't just about making decisions. It's about making sure every voice is heard, every person is seen, and every judgment is fair. After the presentation, as people filed out of the conference room, Judge Matthews' granddaughter Emma ran in, just finished with school. She hugged Sarah, then her grandfather. Did you tell them about our special project? She asked excitedly. Sarah nodded, pulling up one last slide. It showed a new children's book series, co-created by Sarah Bennett and the Montgomery County Courthouse, teaching young readers about justice, fairness, and the importance of listening to all voices. The first book's title read, Judge Wise and Miss Luna's Lessons in Fairness. As the afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, Judge Matthews watched Emma chatting animatedly with Sarah about the next book in the series. In 3 months, one traffic fine had led to revised judicial procedures, new training programs, a children's book series, and countless small moments of better understanding. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at his side with a stack of afternoon cases. Ready for today's sessions, Your Honor. Judge Matthews straightened his robe, feeling its weight differently now. Yes, he said, I'm ready to listen. As he walked toward his courtroom, he could hear Sarah's voice behind him, still talking with Emma about their book project. It was the same voice that had once stood at his podium, the same voice that now helped him and others learn to judge more wisely. The transformation was ongoing, but the path forward was clear. One voice, one case, one moment of understanding at a time.